Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Daniel, and I am with Pluralsight, and I'm here to help with some of the housekeeping, kick things off today, and make sure everything runs smoothly. Before we get to the main event with Gill, I just wanted to kind of touch on a few housekeeping items. Number one, we are recording today's webinar, so a lot of people ask that. If you're joining us via Zoom, then we will send you a link to the recording. Usually we try to get that out in like 24 hours. So keep an eye on the email inbox and you can get a link to the recorded version. If you're watching this on one of Pluralsight's social media channels, then right when it's done, you could rewatch it or share it from the respective social media channels. So that is easy to do. Another thing that people often ask about, we are going to be tackling your questions. I shouldn't say we, it's not going to be me, it's going to be Gill, but he's going to tackle those questions at the end of his presentation today. So definitely as those come to mind, drop those into the Q&A box. I would recommend, we're anticipating a lot of questions, so don't necessarily wait until the end to ask your question. Ask it whenever it comes to mind, and we can kind of get you in that Q&A queue. And so hopefully we'll have time to answer your question. The last thing is, if you run into any issues on Zoom, I'd recommend exiting the Zoom webinar really quickly and rejoining. That usually resolves most issues that people run into. But other than that, I think that takes care of all of our housekeeping today. So let's turn it over to Gill, who's going to talk all about .NET 5.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, good evening, everyone, or maybe good morning from where you are, and welcome to this webinar. So the next 60 minutes or so, maybe a bit more, is going to be indeed all about .NET 5, and I hope to bring you some knowledge on what .NET 5 is and where it is going to be important for you as a .NET developer, so that we see where we are going with .NET 5. So my name is Gill. I'm living in Belgium, where I am the CTO of Xpirit here in Belgium. I've been with Pluralsight already quite a long time. I've been doing courses for close to 9 years now. So you can also see my contact information here as well as my Twitter handle. So if you have any questions after this webinar, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help you. Like I said, I've been doing Pluralsight courses already for a long time. I have now over 30 courses published. So that's quite a lot, mostly on .NET Core and Blazor, Xamarin, HTML5, Bootstrap. So a lot of stuff that hopefully is also interesting to you. The link here will take you to my author page, and that will list out all of my courses. So enough of the publicity. What are we going to be doing today? As mentioned, I want to make it a very interesting 60 minutes or so that covers basically all you need to know about .NET 5. And I know a lot of people that I've met also have been having some questions about .NET 5. Is it important for me? What should I be doing with it? Should I already jump in, or should I hold off a little bit? Well, basically, that's also why I've envisioned this webinar as basically tackling a number of questions. So I've basically wrapped it in a number of questions. The first one is really going to be, well, the most basic question. What is .NET 5? And do I, as a developer, need to care? Do I need to jump on it, or wait a little bit longer before I actually will start using it? That's going to be the first question that I'm going to be trying to answer together with you. Then probably the most important one is what is actually new in .NET 5. If I start using it today, what am I getting out of it? Which technologies have been added? What has been improved? So that is going to be covered in this second topic. It's also going to be, of course, the biggest part or the biggest chunk of this webinar. It's going to take about 30 to 40 minutes, I think. A smaller part is also a question that I often see appearing. What is actually going away for me as a .NET developer? Because that's also important. Are there things going away that I've maybe using now? And how is Microsoft then offering me an alternative solution for that? So that is also something that I'm going to try to answer here. And of course, it doesn't stop with .NET 5. Maybe it's kind of expected, but there is going to be a .NET 6 and .NET 7 and so on. So I'm also going to look together with you at the future. What is next for .NET? What is coming, and how should we prepare for that? Maybe .NET 5 is already a good step up for that. So These questions we'll be looking at during this webinar. And so let's kick things off. And so I'm going to first try to answer the question, what is .NET 5 and why do you need to care as a developer? So that's the first question I need to tackle. Now, tackling that question, I could dive straight in, but I actually prefer to give you a little bit of background here because a lot of people actually have been jumping into .NET in the last couple of years. And yeah, everything seems natural, but there's a lot of things that actually happened maybe before you even started doing .NET. I just turned 42 and I've been doing .NET pretty much my whole professional life. I started doing .NET in the year 2000, 2001. So I've been doing .NET pretty much all my career. And so if you look at what .NET went through, it went through a big evolution. In the beginning, the only thing that we had was pretty much the .NET framework. We still have the .NET framework today. It's currently at version 4.8. That is what is traditionally known as .NET. Windows only. Initially, there were ideas of making .NET also cross-platform at that time, that to make it possible to run it on different platforms. But in the beginning, it was just targeted at .NET and the .NET at Windows, sorry, and the .NET framework is still focused only on Windows. And it's still around, nothing has changed there. We can still use that. That is still actively being supported. But over time, well, things have changed and other .NET platforms have been added. Most notably, I think is Xamarin, which was added to the .NET family actually around 2010. That's when Xamarin as a name and stuff became more and more known. It was the evolution of what was known as MonoTouch and MonoDroid already. And they actually, and I already said the word, they're based on Mono. So the Mono stack is pretty much the open source version of .NET that actually was already introduced way back in 2000, 2001, I think, as the open source alternative created by a couple of people that have now moved to Microsoft. But Xamarin, I'm not going to take you through that whole history, but Xamarin actually runs on a different .NET platform. It's the Mono platform on which it runs. And then in 2016, we actually got .NET Core, probably the biggest revamp of .NET. .NET Core is actually the version that is targeted at cross-platform. And so what we end up with is basically the following picture. We actually have, and I say today, let's say pre.NET 5, we actually end up with this situation. In a situation where there are actually three .NET platforms, I should say. We have, so like I said, we have the .NET framework, we have the Xamarin stack, and we have the .NET Core stack. And the big, let's say, issue is not really a big issue, but for Microsoft, I think it is pretty much a big issue. The thing is that they are all based on a different stack, a different base class library, different SDKs, and so on. So the regular .NET framework is based on the base class library or uses the base class library. Xamarin has its own, the Mono BCL, because it runs on Mono, and .NET Core also has its own base class library called the Core BCL. And this is the situation that we were in, that we have been in for quite a few years already. And yeah, for Microsoft, like I said, it might not be all that great because for developers, what they want is that you write code and they can share that across the board. And what the solution that Microsoft came up with some time ago was .NET Standard, which we probably have, or which I hope you have been using for quite some time already, which allows us to write a .NET Standard library and take that code that is in that .NET Standard library from one platform to the other. That was basically, let's say, the solution that up until .NET Core 3.1, we have been using quite a lot. Now with .NET 5, things are changing. And I put here the title, One Platform to Roll Them All. So basically what is going to happen, all these things are going to be, let's say, merged, are going to be unified. And so .NET 5 is really Microsoft's envisioning of having one .NET platform that allows us to write all kinds of application, be that a desktop application, a cloud application, a web, a game application, a mobile application, or a machine learning and ML application. All of these can actually now be written with the same .NET, and that is .NET 5. One platform, one version of .NET that allows us to do pretty much everything that we want to create. And that is, let's say, maybe the biggest thing that is happening in .NET 5. So like I said, pre.NET 5, we are in the situation where there's different APIs. Like I said, when you write a web application with .NET Core, it's different than a Xamarin application. It runs on a different platform. So there's different SDKs, different APIs sometimes, although the APIs are very similar, they are still, under the covers at least, they're not the same. So that is probably the biggest change that is happening with .NET 5. .NET 5 is all about the unification of .NET. There's a very interesting thing in this line here. It says .NET 5 and .NET 6. Well, that's a very important sentence because .NET 5 is really, let's say, the first part of the unification wave, which we are seeing. Like I just said, these three platforms are going to merge into one .NET. They are now merging into one platform. But that merge, what it's going to bring us is basically a single SDK, one base class library. So basically, we don't have to use .NET Standard anymore. But that is not happening just in .NET 5. It's going to happen in .NET 5 and .NET 6. I think we all know that something external happened, that the virus has been playing a lot of, or causing a lot of damage around the globe. And also Microsoft has been impacted in terms of what they could release in a year. So the vision was that Microsoft was going to release .NET 5 as the unification version, where this unification wave, which they have been touting for quite some time, would actually be complete, but they're human, so it also took them a bit longer. So we are now, let's say, in that wave of unification. This is super important because for you as a developer, whatever you build, it's going to be using that same version of .NET, which is, like I said, a very big deal. So that means that we're going to be using the same .NET to build a cross-platform native UI application. We'll talk about that later because it's actually mostly part of .NET 6. When we look at MAUI later on, this is what is actually going to be .NET's solution to build native applications, so native on your iPhone, native on your Android, but also native on your desktop, or even native on your Mac desktop or your Mac machine. There's also going to be cross-platform web UI, also very important. This is where Blazor comes into play, allowing us to use .NET both on the client and on the server. And of course, with .NET, with this unification wave, Microsoft hasn't forgotten about the cloud, of course not. So everything is now also, of course, built with the cloud in mind. There's a lot of more integration with things such as Kubernetes. And so it's important to understand that we are now in this unification wave. Like I said, Microsoft had the original idea to release all this and to make this merge complete with .NET 5. But like I said, some external factor caused a little bit of a delay, but that's not a big deal. So we are now in this unification wave, which is happening. Some things have already been moved. Some things are already using or are based, let's say, off of this unified platform. Some things aren't. Blazor is already moved. Things like Xamarin, they will, let's say, go to, let's say, their biggest transformation when .NET 6 is going to come out. And so we'll talk about that later on in this presentation. So like I said, one .NET is the idea here, to have one .NET, the one .NET vision, and that is going to be, as I embodied with .NET 5 and .NET 6. It will complete later this year. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that .NET 5 is not ready? That's a question I often hear. People say, oh, .NET 5 is not going to do that. It's not ready. Well, actually, that's not right. So .NET 5 is actually what is known as a current release. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But it doesn't mean that you can't use it for production applications. Far from it. It's an official release. It's definitely possible, and it's actually very easy to move your .NET Core 3.1 applications that you may have now to .NET 5 already. And of course, what you move now to .NET 6, so to .NET 5, I'm sorry, will definitely work later on or be upgradable, let's say, to .NET 6. And of course, .NET 3.1 applications will also be migratable, if that's a word, to .NET 6. But so it doesn't mean that you should stick to .NET Core 3.1 per se. You can definitely use .NET 5 in production. Now, I did mention that .NET Core 3.1 and .NET 5, they're a bit different in terms of, let's say, support. Now, what is good is that Microsoft now has put out a .NET roadmap for .NET that is basically giving us a roadmap for the next coming years. So the ID, so in 2019, Microsoft released 3.1. And 3.1 is what is known as an LTS version, or a long-term support version. And so an LTS means that Microsoft will be releasing security updates, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's 2 years after the release of the next release. So that would be, I think, well into 2022, that Microsoft will be supporting with security updates, that is .NET Core 3.1. Now, look, what is different with .NET 5 or .NET 5 is that it is what is known as a current release. So a current release means that it's actually having a shorter life cycle. Meaning that Microsoft will not be providing security updates for such a long time. I think it's 6 months until after the release of the next version. And I recommend, if you want to be 100% sure how long this period is, it is just look it up, .NET roadmap, and you'll find how long these release cycles are. So that means that .NET 5 can be used today, and it will be supported well until also in 2022, because later this year we will be getting already .NET 6, and that's again an LTS version. And in 2022 we'll be getting .NET 7, and you may have guessed, in 2023 we'll be getting .NET 8. So you see that there's a good cadence in there. So the good news is that now Microsoft has been doing or has been announcing this roadmap. For companies, it's easy. Yeah, you can really align on, hey, do I jump on the bandwagon directly, or do I wait and do I do my release cadence or update cadence every 2 years? And I see the two being done. So some people say, well, let's go straight into .NET 5 and then we'll upgrade it, I'd say, pretty quickly after the release of .NET 6, and that's fine. And if you say, well, I stay on .NET 3.1, that's also fine. Then you can update easily to .NET 6. So this release cadence is really what we're going to have now with .NET. Every November, it's going to be Christmas already, and we're going to get a new version of .NET. A predictable schedule, I think that's something that a lot of people were hoping for. I hope I've given you already a bit of an idea of should you be using it. Now, one thing that I also, in terms of answering the question completely, is what is happening to .NET Standard? Now, if you look up .NET Standard, .NET 5, you'll find a whole long blog post from Imo Landwehr, who works at the .NET Core team. And he goes in a lot of detail into how that relation, let's say, between .NET 5 and .NET Standard and the future of .NET Standard is going to be. Now, with .NET 5, we are getting what is known as the .NET 5.0 Target Framework Moniker. It's a very complex word, so TFM for short. And it's basically the target framework that we are going to be compiling all applications against. So pretty much everything that you are going to build is going to be targeting .NET 5. But so .NET 5, and that's important to understand, is everything, like I said, is the unified framework, the unified BCL that we're going to be targeting. But of course, not everything is in there. You can say, saying, just he said that everything is moving. Well, yes, of course, all the shared stuff is moving. So that's mostly all the non-UI stuff. So that means that .NET 5.0 Windows is another target that you can typically be, or that you will typically be using for a WPF application. There's also .NET 5 iOS. There's also .NET 5 Android. Those are different, let's call them add-on packages that you use on top of your .NET 5 libraries. And they contain the specifics for that particular target. Now, I've put a little asterisks behind the iOS, and they don't exist. They would have existed if Microsoft had already released all of the new version. They actually will be released with .NET 6. But it's just this graph really shows you how the relation is going to be. So you have your base is going to be .NET 5, and the UI stuff typically is going to be in one of those different let's say packages. Let's call them add-on packages. Now, what about .NET Standard then? Well, if you think about it, .NET 5 is really, let's say, the next evolution of .NET Standard, because it also allows you to share pretty much everything and use it everywhere. And .NET Standard, is that going to go away? Well, I don't think there's going to be a next version of .NET Standard, really. But you still have to use it if you want to share code between a non.NET 5 technology. Say that you still want to also share code with the .NET Framework application, so a .NET 4.8 application. Well, then you still have to use .NET Standard. right? So I hope with this, I've already given you a bit of an idea of what .NET 5 is and should you be actually looking at it. Now, the next question that I want to answer is what is now new in .NET 5? I think that's also an important question that I need to answer. Is it interesting for you to already jump on? Now, in general, there are a few things that I see as I say, themes that I see popping up across the board that have been added. So major improvements that I see have been made in .NET 5. And I think the first one is a very broad one. There are technical improvements. You can say, oh, fantastic, but it's actually true. And I'll take you through some of these very soon. And not to underestimate performance enhancements, very important performance enhancements. I've been doing Blazor development for quite some time. And the day I basically switched the applications that I'm working on to .NET 5, I was like, whoa, blown away. The performance improvements I had by just switching to .NET 5 is amazing. So that alone can already be, let's say, a reason for you to jump on .NET 5 because it goes, it's actually a lot of things are much more performant. And I'll talk about this in more detail in just a minute. C# has a new version released, C# 9. There's also a new version of F#. I've never used F# myself, so I cannot answer any questions about that, but there are new versions of these two languages. We'll talk a bit about C# 9 in just a minute. There's also some tooling enhancements. I think the biggest tooling enhancements have been made to something that you may not be expecting that is still really supported, but Windows Forms. Of course, there's millions and millions of applications that have been built with it, and Microsoft is now fully supporting WinForms on top of .NET 5, and they have released a new version of the Windows Forms design, and it's actually a super big improvement in terms of tooling that has been added with .NET 5. Like I said, the new .NET 5.0 target framework moniker, that's basically the framework version that you'll be targeting, and then new technologies, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. So let's go through these in a bit more detail, shall we? So like I said, there's a new version of C#, C# 9. Now, I think we can do at least one full webinar, probably more, about C# 9. There's a lot of interesting stuff that has been added. I think if you look up C# 9, the first thing probably that you'll find is that this thing records were added. And I'll talk a bit about records in just a minute. There's also this new thing called init-only setters, which is also a very interesting feature. Actually works pretty much together, or can be used, let's say, in combination with records. And I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. There's also this thing called top-level statements, which are not such a big change, but it's actually interesting to see. And if you would see them without knowing about them, you could be like, whoa, what's this? And I'll talk about them in just a minute as well. And there's also some improvements, some changes to the pattern matching system in C#, which has been added, C# 7, I think, and that has been improved with every release, and also in C# 9, there have been some changes. I won't be discussing those in more detail, but I'll give you some resources and pointers to other courses that go deep on this. So let's talk a bit about these changes in a bit more detail. And the first one is the records. Now, if you think about your application, and really your code, let's say, what are you typically going to use? You're typically going to use a class, and a class is reference type, and you're going to put data in there. Could be a service class. A service class works in its own data. And the other thing that you typically also use for data is a value type, which is like a struct or something. Those are the two things which they have available for us in .NET to store data and to also store functionality, of course. But if you think about the data, data is typically, let's say, can be mutable. A service class needs to change its own data. But other things should actually be, let's say, immutable. If you think, the best example I can give you is a DTO. A data transfer object that could be an API that you have in a Blazor application that you talk with from a Blazor application, and so an object is being created and that travels along, and that contains just data. It's just the data transfer object, and that data is immutable, meaning that nothing should actually be changing it. So let's say we don't really have that that language construct, let's say, at least we didn't have, to really point to something that contains immutable data, and it just is there to be a container for data. Well, that is actually now possible, and that is now possible through this thing called records. And so a record is really a new language construct available in C# 9 that is, let's say, used to contain immutable data. It is still a reference type. It's not like a struct, so it's still a reference type, and it behind the scenes, it is in fact just a class, but it's actually meant to be containing immutable data. Now, this is, like I said, it's technically new. It's actually new, I should say, in C# 9. And we could, in fact, already build it before with just classes. You can do that, but it's actually pretty hard, a lot of boilerplating stuff that you need to do. And now with C# 9, it's actually built in. Now, the record itself should be like your signal to say, hey, this data, I should not be changing it. Yeah? And you can enforce it, and I'll talk a bit about that in the demo. But it's really just a container for data, and it also provides other functionalities. That boilerplating I was just talking about, since it is actually a container for data, it will also contain a lot of semantics, let's say, to do equality checks, because it works on the data. Is this record the same as this one? If you do that with plain instances, with plain objects, what are you actually comparing when you ask to C#, hey, are these two objects the same? Basically, you're checking if the two are pointing to the same object on the heap. Well, in records, you can actually do comparisons of data. Kind of cool. And I'll show it in just a second. And like I said, internally, if you look at the IL, the generated intermediate language code, it's still boilerplate. But I'm saying it's still a class with a lot of boilerplate code added to it. So internally, nothing has really changed. So I see a lot of questions around it. Is this working with reflection, and is this working with overloads? Yes, because it's actually still a class when it's being compiled. But yeah, you shouldn't be if you try to access it with reflection. Of course, it's definitely going to be possible. But that's basically not the idea. But let me show you a record. So this is a record, and you can say, well, that looks pretty similar to a class. And in fact, yeah, the most simple record that I can show you looks very similar to a class. It has, in this case, a couple of properties. But I don't want to point too much attention to it, but there is one thing that you should see. There's also this init in that property. There's a last name and a first name init. Those are what is known as init-only properties. And I'll talk a bit more about those in just a minute, because they actually can be used in combination with records. They can be used in combination with classes as well, but they can be used with records, let's say, to enforce, maybe not the correct word, but to use in combination with that immutable data. Now, what is really the idea with the records is I can instantiate a record instance like I do with the class. I new it up, and there you go. I pass some data to it, and we're done. Yeah. Now, since this is all centered around data, when I say I want to create a new instance based on this existing one, I can actually create a copy, and I can actually say person copy equals person with a changed version of the last name. So what this will do behind the scenes, basically will create a copy, a property per property copy, and it's going to override, or it's going to change, let's say, last name. And so my last name is going to be changed here. That's the with syntax here. That is what that actually is kind of the idea. You're actually working with the data inside of this object here, of this record here. Like I said, what it also contains is equality checks, and that's actually generated for you. If I new up two records, and event price DTO is a record here, it's actually part of the demo that we'll use. So it's a record, and I will create two new record instances. As you can see, I'm newing them up. By the way, notice what I'm doing there. I say new, and then just parentheses. I don't repeat event price DTO. That's also another C# 9 thing. You don't have to repeat the name of the type if C# basically can understand what the type is going to be. In other words, it needs to know on the left-hand side. If you use var, it's not going to work, because then it doesn't know what it needs to do. But if I already declare on the left, this is going to be an event price DTO, it already knows it will need to instantiate an event price DTO. It's a new thing as well. I'm not going to go further into it, but this is also something that was added. Now, what am I doing? I'm creating 2 new instances of that event price DTO record, and then I'm asking C Sharp, are they equal? And it says, actually, this will return true. It will say, yes, these are true, same. And you can be thinking, whoa, that's weird. And this is where they differ from objects. Because 2 objects would not be identical unless they are a copy, unless they point to the same instance, I should say. Here we are creating 2 new instances, and it will do a comparison for each of the properties in there. That's what it's have the same ID, the same test, music hall, 80 and 100. They are the same, and C# will say, oh, these 2 records are identical. And since they are reference types, they can have constructors. You can do a lot of stuff that you can do with, indeed, classes. But then you can say, well, why can I use them then? Well, like I said, you can very easily use them to represent data, immutable data like DTO. And this is also a place where I think records are very useful. I can actually very easily use this shortened syntax, a shorthand. Here I'm creating the same class, sorry, the same record, I should say, person. And notice what I'm doing. It looks as if this is like, it looks a bit like a constructor syntax. This is actually the declaration of a full record that contains a first name and a last name property. And behind the scenes, all the boilerplate stuff will be created for you. Again, you now can just new up a person here, like I've done before. So say, this is going to save a lot of lines of code. To use this syntax in terms of full classes with all the properties, the backing fields, I don't know what, and the constructors, this is going to be a lot cleaner and shorter to use. So just to recap, they do support equality checks, and I'll show you this in the demo in just a minute. Another thing that I haven't mentioned, it also comes with an overridden toString that has a JSON representation. So basically, if you ask a record to string yourself, it will give you a nice JSON representation. And since they're reference types, they can be inherited, they can be sealed. They're just reference types behind the scenes, right? So all of that can still be done and still applies. Now, before the demo, I'm going to show you 2 more small things. This one is that coming back to that init thing, that init property, or that init only property, basically is what you would expect. So normally you would have a get and a set on a property, or a private set even. Well, this goes a step further. An init property means that it can be set only from certain places and only once. So for example, if I have an object initializer, I love object initializers, I use them all the time. But an object initializer means that you have to have a mutable property. Now you can actually say, well, I'm going to use that object initializer, but combine it with an init. And then they don't require mutable properties anymore. That's kind of cool. They can also be combined even with read-only fields, because those init values can actually be used from the constructor, and also put their values in a read-only field. Kind of a cool feature, can be used on the class as you see here, but can also be used on a record. And the last thing that I'll show you, and then we'll jump into Visual Studio, is this Hello World. You can be thinking, wow, did I come to this webinar to see Hello World? Well, yes, I know. This is what your typical Hello World would look like, a console application that just writes Hello World to the screen. Now, this can actually now, with this thing called top-level statements, be written a lot more concise, really. What you see here is actually the shorthand version using top-level statements. You don't need to have in one place in your application, of course, all that boilerplate that sits around this. So this can now be shortened to this. And in fact, I could actually write it on one line. So say that system, system.console.writeLine, I could say, and then I also have the using statement that I can kick out. So we can actually have one place in our application that C# will recognize, that will recognize, hey, this is the entry. And what used to be a main is now, let's say, recognized as your other entry. Kind of cool. Not a big deal, but yeah, it's there. And I think if you see it the first time in an application that you're looking at, you can be a little bit amazed. So let me quickly go to Visual Studio here and show you a bit around in records. So this is, by the way, a demo I borrowed from my good friend Roland, and I'll show you his course on C# 9 in just a minute. And so this is an extract of that demo. He goes in a lot more detail. So see what we have here. We have a couple of classes, an event price DTO, which inherits from the DTO base, and there's a couple of other classes that inherit also from that DTO base. But you see, it's still quite a lot of code. I have all these properties and that sort of thing. In fact, since I can add methods to records, but since I'm not doing that here in my classes, I can actually very easily replace these with records. And let me comment this out. There we go. And I'm going to replace this with the same, but then using records. And I'll put the cursor here. There we go, and uncomment these. And so now, as you can see, I've now replaced this with a record, another record that inherits, because inheritance is perfectly fine with records. And notice how concise the syntax now is. And this now represents something that should not be changed. This is now going to be behind the scenes generating all these properties behind the scenes for me. I don't have to do that, but I can now use this. I can instantiate this as before. And behind the scenes, also that equality value, equality check code and stuff is also going to be generated. So let's see how we can use that now. I'm instantiating here two event price DTOs, as you can see. Those are just containing the same values, an integer value, a datetime value, I think, and a string and an enumeration and so on and so on. And what I now can do, and let me run it in the meantime. It's not the biggest, nicest application, but it works perfectly fine to see what we are looking at here. And I hope this is readable. So what you see here on line 1 is actually the toString implementation of that DTO, that record that we have created here. And notice that this is now giving me that JSON representation. So it's not doing the regular toString that we know for years and years, which just returns a type. Now this is just giving me a JSON representation. But now it gets interesting. I have these two DTOs, which, like I mentioned, are identical. And I'm going to ask .NET, hey, are they identical, please? And it's going to say, yes, they are the same. And it's not looking at the objects. No, it's actually looking at the values. It's going to do a property per property comparison of the values. And these two are not the same. And it will indeed say, well, no, they're not the same. Yeah. The reference equals are not going to be pointing to the same. Indeed, it's not. I've actually made two different records. So actually the references are not going to be the same, as you can see here. And there's some other stuff here as well. There's also an overloaded, and that's the last thing I'm going to point out here. There's also an overloaded double equals operator, which also allows me to do that comparison or that equality check, like I've shown you before. So this is records. What I can now also do, and just to make this a bit more interesting, is I can actually take all this out, and also this, and now my application is using these top-level statements. If I now run this, it will do the exact same thing. You would expect C# to blow up because you don't have a main. I have code basically in the top level, hence top-level statements, and it still works fine. So again, that boilerplate is going to be generated for you. Might not be the biggest thing ever, but it actually is kind of cool if you see it the first time. All right. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about C#9. There is definitely a lot more to discover in C#9. And like I said, Roland has a course which was released, I think, last December, that goes in more depth on C#9. So take a look at the link you see here to learn more about C#9. Now, there's a lot of technical improvements or technology improvements also that happened in .NET 5. And the first one, and it's not because I love it so much, Blazor, but it's actually, there's a lot of big things. And if you look at .NET 5's biggest list of enhancements, is definitely has happened in Blazor. So if you don't know Blazor, I'll give you some pointers in just a minute. But Blazor is really this cool technology that allows you to write C# and to write interactive applications in the browser. So you can actually write what you typically do in JavaScript, but you can now do that using C#. Really cool. And if you've never touched on it, it might be a bit more complex, let's say, to follow, but I'm going to briefly touch on the newest features that have been added with Blazor 5. There's been new components. Blazor is component-based, meaning that pretty much everything is a component. The page is a component, the button is a component, and so on. And they have added in the package a couple of new components, and I'll show you what in just a minute. Performance, like I already said, this for me was the biggest reason to, let's say, directly upgrade my applications to .NET 5, because I noticed the biggest performance improvement on JSON serialization and deserialization. That has gone up dramatically. I think like 5 times faster. I don't know, but that for me was a no-brainer. Virtualization, I'll talk about virtualization in just a minute. It's basically also a performance thing, allows you to work with larger sets of data in the UI more easily. Lazy loading allows you to basically bring in a component when you just need it, so on demand. There's CSS isolation and there's JavaScript isolation, I should say as well, and also some enhancements to the tools. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I want to touch briefly on some of the highlights and then show them also in a running application. So like I said, there's quite a few new components that have been added. The most important one is the input file, as well as the input radio combined with the input radio group. The input file, as you may have guessed, is going to allow me from a Blazor application to upload stuff. I can just write this code here, input file, and that allows to the browser, because Blazor applications typically run in the browser, to open a file dialog, allows the user to basically select a file that can be accessed from the Blazor application. You can read it out in this method called onInputFileChange, and that will then be uploaded to the browser, to the server. So this can, for example, be used to upload a file to an API, and that's also why I use it. And I'll show you this in just a minute in a demo. Like I said, a lot of stuff has happened around performance, and that includes also in this new virtualized component. This virtualized component is solving a problem where Blazor was, let's say, using a lot of memory when you have a long list of data that you wanted to show. If you're looping over a set of data and you're creating a table or something, it could actually take up quite some memory. Now with the virtualize, it actually is basically possible to ask Blazor to just render the items which are in the view. And you can do that first with downloading the entire set, or even on demand asking for more data. Very cool. And it allows you to, or it gives you, let's say, again, increased performance. CSS isolation, if you come from Angular, you probably know this as well. So Blazor up until now had the, how should I say, limitation? Yeah, that's it. Let's call it limitation, where all the CSS had to be in global files, global style files, global style sheets. With Blazor 5, it's now possible to actually isolate CSS and JavaScript for one component, or on a per component basis. So if you have CSS or JavaScript that is linked to one, or only used for one component, you just add this, the name of the component, .razor.css, and automatically will be linked to that component that you're then building. It basically will remove a lot of the code from the global CSS, so global styles. So that's cleaner. It's not a big deal, but again, one of these small things that make Blazor a bigger joy to work with. What I also like is lazy loading. So lazy loading, as the name implies, is taking away the need to download the entire Blazor application at once. If you've never looked at Blazor, this may seem a bit over the top to understand, but basically what Blazor is doing in WebAssembly, your application is going to be downloaded and runs inside of the browser. So if you have a big application, yeah, a couple of megabytes will need to be downloaded. Could be that it takes too long. So now can actually cut it up. And so you can basically say at the startup, we just download, let's say, the shell and the login page and that sort of thing. And then when we go on, we download based on navigation the next parts. That's how it's done. And so this allows me to actually cache DLLs, cache assemblies, because it's DLLs that are being downloaded, that are being run from the browser, and it will definitely help with speeding up the improvement, but I'm saying that the startup of my application. So my application is definitely going to be starting up faster because there's less to download. And it's very simple to do. In the project file, you just add this line, maybe a comma-separated list of DLLs that you want to download on demand, basically saying only download this component on demand, and you have to write some code that says when we navigate to this page, for example, then load that component. And so Blazor will understand that it doesn't need to download everything at once, but only, let's say, on demand. It will download the extra components. Again, something that is cool to help with the performance and the initial load time of your Blazor application. Let me quickly show you that in a demo. So let me go here. over here, and let's open this solution here. I'm going to drag it into Visual Studio. Hopefully that will work. Sometimes when you're running a webinar, dragging stuff around is not always working fine. Yeah, there we go. So let's see if this works. If this should start up before I can show it to you. So this is actually the Blazor application I use for all my Blazor courses here on Pluralsight, called Bethany Spy Shop. It's, as the name gives away, an imaginary pie store for Bethany. There we go. So this is actually the HRM application. So she's been expanding a little bit and she has hired some staff. And so this is her application to manage that staff. So this is a Blazor application, a WebAssembly application, fully downloaded to my browser. And let's take a look at some of the new stuff that we have here. So this is working off of an API. So I can actually add a new employee here, or let's say edit one. And you see here this sample here. I can actually use this input file. There we go. And I can go here and select this person here as the image. So I can, from a Blazor application, now get access to that image. And you see that Blazor has now selected or has access to that, and it will now be able to look at the bytes inside of that image and upload that to my API. And then on my API, I can store that data inside the database or as a file as well. That's one of the things that was added in Blazor. What I can't really show you is that my application is split up into multiple parts, but what I can show you, and let me do that one first. So this is the list of employees. It's kind of a short list, but I also have added here another page called Employee Overview Virtual. And this will actually show us, and you see here, that's a very long list of employees. And notice the scroll bar here is very small. In a regular Blazor application, I think there's 10,000 records that I have in here. In a regular Blazor application, those 10,000 records, it would actually, you would see Blazor render it. It would stutter a bit. Yeah. Now, with this virtualization, this is that using that virtualized component, I can actually scroll very quickly. And as you see, I'm going faster than Blazor can render it. But as soon as I stop, it renders. Yeah. And it doesn't render all these 10,000, I don't know much, I don't know how many rows at once. It just creates or just renders the ones that are currently into view. And that's done through this virtualized component. Let's go to the code and just for just a minute. So this is that employee overview virtual. That's actually the one that shows here. And as you see, this is this virtualized component. I pointed to a method to download new data. So I can basically ask Blazor to send a new request when it needs new items. So this is all done for you behind the scenes. It actually works quite well. And you just create a record, or I should say a row, because otherwise you're confused with those records that we already mentioned in C# line. So it just creates a new row on the fly. And as soon as you start scrolling, it asks for new data. This application also uses virtualization. In fact, if we go here to the C# project file, you can see in here that there is this components library, that's this one here, which is going to be loaded on demand. On demand, it's actually doing that. I need to write a little bit of code for that. If I'm not mistaken, it's in the app Razor. Basically, in that components library, there's a map component in there. That map component is actually, where is my Blazor application gone to? Oh, here. That's actually rendering this map component. And that is now in a separate component. And you didn't see anything happening. But it's nice to know that I've actually downloaded this map component on the fly. I've actually downloaded the entire library that contains that map component on the fly. Basically, what I've written here is I said, well, when we navigate to the employee detail page, then bring in that extra DLL. And allows me to basically say, well, I create like a shell application. And when I navigate to product management, then I bring in the product management DLL. And when I navigate to customer management, I bring in that customer management DLL. So it allows me to split up my application into separate parts, making that initial download also smaller. Kind of cool. So like I said, you may have noticed already, I really like Blazor. I've been using it for quite some time. I've also written a Blazor course here on Pluralsight, which has also already been updated to Blazor 5. So if you're interested in that, take a look at this link here, and that will take you to a page that contains all the the full Blazor application that you saw here, with more in there that we built together, as well as see how this can be used in combination with all the novelties in .NET 5. So that's all in this course. EF Core. I think pretty much everyone is now familiar with Entity Framework. Also, that has received an update for .NET 5. Again, a very long list of new things. So again, and I think Julie Lerman had a webinar like 2 weeks ago on .NET 5. So I'm definitely not going to go over all these changes, but there's a lot of new stuff that has been added here. Simple logging. So it's very easy now to say, well, this thing, what we're doing here, log that, for example, to the console. I'll show you that in just a minute. What I think is the biggest change, I actually have two, which are on my top new features, is many-to-many. So previously, when you did a many-to-many relation, you had to create that intermediate, so the normalized thing, also as an entity. You had to do that yourself. Now Blazor, EF Core will do that for you. So that is now included. The second, and like I said, it's pretty much tie for me, which I like most, but the next one is the filtered include. Basically allows you to do a where on an included entity type. So I'll show you in just a demo. That's easier to understand. And there's also the ability to say to the change tracker, and the change tracker sits behind EF Core. You can also say, okay, clear everything now. And I'll show you that in the demo in just a minute as well. So like I said, many-to-many is probably my favorite new feature. Basically, it allows me to write something like this. I have pies and categories. Each pie belongs to multiple categories, and each category can contain multiple pies. If I were to do that before EF Core 5, I would have to write that intermediate entity myself. Now it's going to be automatically generated for me, and so I don't have to do that myself anymore. The filtered include, like I said, is allowing me to do another where, so do a query or a filter on something that I'm including. So in this case, I'm including, sorry, I'm querying for pies, but I'm also going to include, what am I including here? The categories where the name contains the word fruit. So this is not filtering the pies, it is filtering what is being included. And it is something that also, yeah, you could do it, but it was something that you had to do manually. It's now also supported in EF Core 5. And the log too, like I said, is basically going to allow us to do some simple logging. For example, here I'm doing a simple log to the console. Allows me to quickly see what is going on in my application. So let's take a look at EF Core 5 very quickly. So let me switch demos here. Let's go to here. Did I stop this from running? Because otherwise, yeah, okay, that's good. So let's bring in a very small EF Core test application. So I have here my pies, and like I said, my pies have categories, and similarly, my categories contain pies. If we look at the code, so what I'm doing here is actually what I'm going to do. I've already run this, so there's a seeder down here that basically creates categories and creates pies and adds the pies to the categories and vice versa. And I'm adding this to my database. So I've already run this code. This has generated for me a database. And database is called EF Core test, EF Core 5 test. And if you look here under the tables that have been generated, so we have categories and pies which are generated, but also category pie. I haven't created category pie as an entity. This has been created automatically by EF Core 5 because of that many-to-many relationship support. Yeah, I can run this, of course, but it's not going to be blowing you away, I think. There we go. So what you have here is I'm basically looping over my pies and my categories. So each pie belongs to one or more categories. And that's what you see here. That's that many-to-many that is being used here. I'm also using here the change tracker.clear, which allows me to say to the change tracker, okay, throw out everything that you've been tracking at this point. And then finally, what I'm doing here is I'm using, and I should have actually put it, because I'm not outputting that somewhere. So let me do that again. What I'm asking to EF Core here is give me all the pies. I think there's 11 pies in here. But now give me back, include all the categories that have the name that starts with seasonal. and there was a seasonal pies category here. So what will this include? Let's take a look. Let's take a look here. So this is still going to contain these 11 pies, right? Because it's not filtering on the pies. It's actually filtering on what is being included. So this one actually, if we look at the categories, it's not having any categories. While pie 1 was in a category, but it's not in, if you look here somewhere, lots of lorem ipsum text. See, it's in C1, C2. It's not in that first one. So it's not in that in that third one. So it's not in the seasonal one. Hence, categories have not been included. If we look at the second pie that has C3, so here indeed only the category that has the seasonal pies, that's called seasonal pies, is included. That's how I'm doing that filtering. And you may have noticed something else. See that output here. That's typically shown in Visual Studio. This I've actually included by on my DB context. I've used that simple logging, log2, which is simply going to write to the console, in this case, information level logging information. So all of that is being rendered to my console. All right. Cool stuff. Like I said, the expert on Entity Framework is Julie Lerman, I think, and she has already updated her course on to .NET 5 as well, and I have included the link here as well. So if you're interested in more, take a look there. There's two more things I want to show here. Xamarin Forms 5. Xamarin Forms, the mobile technology for Microsoft to build or to target Android and iOS, has also been, let's say, updated. And it's I was in doubt, should I include it, because it was really not included at the release time of .NET 5, but I think 2 weeks ago, Microsoft released Xamarin Forms 5, so in January. It is still running on a mono stack. A lot of things are changing for .NET when we go to .NET 6, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, including what it is running. But Xamarin Forms, to be clear, is still fully supported, is still something that you can also build your applications upon. It's a fully new version that has been released. Now, what has been added? There's a couple of things that have been added, quite a few things that have been added, I should say. Some of these things were already available before, but have now been moved into the core, let's say. There's new controls that have been added. There's a drawing framework, which I think is probably maybe not the biggest update, but still a very interesting thing that was added. There is the full support for using just an iPhone and a PC to test your applications, not to compile for a store release, but to do debugging. You can just now plug in your iPhone into your PC. Doesn't have to be a Mac, and you can also do iOS development or debugging. Not, like I said, a release for the store that still requires a Mac. There's drag and drop support. There's the new UI web view, which was required because sometimes otherwise, if you used your old web view, your iOS app could be rejected. That's now been solved as well. And there's also an improved an improved version of Hot Reload, which is kind of cool. It's actually rewritten from scratch, allowing you to do that Hot Reload. So you change the Xamarin Forms, and it automatically is updated. The changes are reflected in your on your device or in your emulator. So, like I said, new controls. Probably the biggest one that I was anticipating is the carousel view, allowing you to swipe through stuff, combined with optionally combined, I say, with the indicator view, which is the thing you see at the bottom to allow the user to see where they are at inside of the in the carousel. There's also the swipe view, allowing you to swipe items away, for example, inside of a list. Like I said, what I think is pretty much a big change is the shape and drawing framework, allowing me to do stuff like drawing rectangles with a fill. If you've been using XAML in other technologies such as WPF, this hasn't changed. So there's a couple of things which are not exactly the same, but a lot of things have been taken over from WPF XAML or Windows Phone XAML or whatever you. So all of that, where we could do rectangles and drawing, has now also been added into Xamarin Forms, coming from very simple rectangles to very complex parts, allowing you to do all kinds of drawing inside of your application. I'm not going to spend too much time here showing you all these new features, because that again could take could take at least a full webinar. Let's take a quick look at the ability to draw, so that shapes framework that we have in Xamarin Forms 5 now. So while it's starting up, you can already see here. So there's now the ability to create rectangles and can actually go more complex. So these rectangles, there's ellipses. So all of that pretty simple stuff, but allows you to do a very powerful stuff inside of your mobile applications. And this takes a while to compile again. But while we wait, let's now patiently wait. There we go. So don't expect something huge, but you're going to see rectangles on the screen. There we go. Fantastic. Pretty hard to do without this version of Xamarin Forms 5. So you can do rectangles, you can do ellipses, but you can also do more complex stuff. I like this baby elephant demo. This is actually a drawing made in Xamarin. Or in XAML, I should say. Of course, you don't do this with just rectangles. There's a lot of more complex stuff that sits behind the scenes. It actually uses path, multiple paths and polygons and stuff like that. So this is a very complex thing. This is fully coordinate based. So this is now also fully supported. This is code I think I can just copy it from an old WPF application and put it now here also in Blazor. And you can, like you see here, also convert SVG into this. That also is possible because it's actually a vector-based drawing that I'm doing. To save us some time, I'm not going to do any more demos on Xamarin Forms. And where did my stop button go to? Somewhere over here, because I'm on a lower resolution. Okay, let's not worry about that. Let's kill Visual Studio. Okay, there we go. Don't save. There we go. Now, again, there's many new features in Xamarin Forms that you can look at. We also have a full learning part on Blazor. Sorry, on Xamarin 5. What am I doing with Blazor? Did I mention I like it? So this is the link for that full part on Xamarin Forms. WPF and WinForms. I'm not going to spend too much time here. There is actually full support to run your WPF and WinForms applications on top of .NET 5. It was already supported on .NET Core. They now will target this .NET 5.0 Windows thing. And you see here on the screenshot, it's not just targeting .NET 5.0. This is targeting .NET 5.0 Windows, meaning that it is running on .NET 5. It is running on that unified stack. But on top of that, there's an add-on package that allows you to do .NET 5.0 Windows stuff. This is actually using that extension. And probably the biggest change, like I said already, is, you may be thinking, oh, this is an old technology. Yeah, but Microsoft is still fully committed now to also support WinForms development on top of .NET 5. Now, to save us some time, because we're already we've been talking for quite some time already, I'm going to skip the demo. I was just going to show you that you can do that now also on .NET 5. And last technology improvement that I wanted to talk briefly about is this thing called Project Tie. Now, what is Project Tie all about? Well, first, setting the scene a little bit. If you look at application development today, applications are becoming larger and larger every day. Yeah? They're becoming larger. They consist out of multiple components, and that typically takes you through a microservices architecture where you have a lot of moving parts. I have a lot of APIs, maybe a service bus and that sort of thing. If I'm a developer on such an application or such a team that does microservices architecture, there's a lot of things that I need to understand before I actually can be productive. It actually can take a while to set up this type of application on my machine to actually run it. There's so many moving parts. I have to set up all these ports, the configuration, I don't know what, maybe some containers. That can actually take a while. And Microsoft has noticed that. And they said, well, why don't we try to do that for you? And that's actually what Project Tie is all about. It's, at this point, still an experimental project. And it tries to, you basically throw your Visual Studio solution at it, so to say, and it will try to understand the structure. Of course, you can help it a little bit as well. But it actually will look at all the different projects, look at its configuration, and give you a dashboard to see what it discovered inside of the application. So there's service discovery as well as port configuration built in. Kind of cool. Like I said, it's pretty clever. So it will look at some of these things automatically. You can also work in combination, or it can also work in combination with YAML files to understand more in depth what the structure of the application is going to be. It is also, of course, it actually behind the scenes is based on containers. So it actually can also be used if you say, well, in my in my microservice architecture, I have this microservice that is based I'm also using a SQL Server container. Well, if you put that in a YAML file, it will also make sure that that is all brought in for you. So all of that is done for you. It's actually based on Kubernetes behind the scenes. So it's actually very cool technology. It's still experimental, so it changes still. I'm not going to do a demo of it, but you can actually go to the GitHub page, github.com/.net/tye, so TYE, and that will give you, you can download it from there, you can start playing with it. Like I said, it's still experimental. That's also why I'm not putting any demo into here, because it might actually change while this video is online. Now, we don't have a video or a course on Pluralsight yet on Project Tye. Like I said, it's not released yet, but we do have a full path actually on microservices. And I have included the link here, and I think there's like 8 courses that take you from being completely unfamiliar with microservices in .NET Core all the way to deploying a microservices .NET Core solution into Kubernetes. So it takes that simple solution all the way through. Now, 2 more questions, and they are shorter, I promise. And what is going away with .NET 5? It's something that I hear a lot of people discussing as well. Is .NET 5 going to take away my cheese? What am I going to need to do? Well, I think web forms. This has been clear for a while, I think. If you are actively building new web forms applications, I don't think it's just a good path for that. So there is not going to be an updated version of web forms that is going to come out for .NET 5 or .NET 6, whatever. So there's no commitment from Microsoft anymore around web forms. So there's definitely alternative technologies that can help you here. Blazor, of course, being one. And actually, because of, you can even integrate an existing web forms application together with Blazor. That's possible. Microsoft has an ebook on that, so just look up web forms and Blazor and you'll find it. Of course, MVC applications, right? So all the stuff on MVC is a supported technology. Alternatively, Razor Pages. I'm more a fan of MVC personally, as personal preference, I think, but yeah, I prefer MVC applications for a lot of applications, and of course, a SPA. Blazor is also a SPA, so a single page application on top of a .NET Core backend. Those are, if you're still working with web forms, your future technologies, I believe. If you're still working with WCF, the Windows Communication Foundation, what is happening there? Again, there is no support, and it's not going to be a WCF.NET 5 or .NET 6 version coming out. No, not going to happen. So there are alternatives, of course, .NET Core API, REST APIs, basically, or gRPC. That's also been supported now since .NET Core 3.1. Look at these to take your WCF development to the next level, let's say, because also WCF is not going to transition into the .NET 5 or later array. And then the final question. Now we're here with .NET 5. What are we going to evolve to? What is then next for .NET 5? Well, you may have guessed it, .NET 6. Ta-da! And then .NET 7 and so on. But let's focus on that .NET 6. What do we already know about .NET 6 at this point? Well, .NET 6 is going to be an LTS version again. So it's going to be, it's an even number, and 6 is an even number. That means that Microsoft is going to give us a longer range or a longer period, let's say, of support. So 2 years up until starting to count after the release of the next version. So that's quite long. So it's going to be released this year, 2021, November 2021, if all goes according to plan, but I think that's going to happen. It is going to be completing that unification wave part 2, let's say. And probably the biggest update that's going to come out is what is known as MAUI. And I'll talk about MAUI in just a second. So again, it's not all MAUI. There's a lot of new stuff probably going to be released for .NET 6. At the time that we are creating this webinar, and then I'm speaking here. .NET 6 is not available yet in beta bits or alpha bits or whatever. Of course, it's all developed out in the open. So basically, if you look at the GitHub pages on GitHub, you actually can see what Microsoft is working on. They have this page here on GitHub on the ASP.NET Core change tracker, where they are listing out things that are considering. These are, as far as I know, not confirmed, but I picked out two that I really like. And I really like that they're going to do for ASP.NET Core a hot reload. So basically, you run the application, you change something, you don't have to stop the debugger and start again. CSS isolation also is on that list. So take a look at this list. It's a changing document. It could be that hot reload by the time you look at it, even if I look at it now, is not on that list anymore. But when I looked at it, when I was creating this webinar over the Christmas holidays, it was there. So I really like that they're doing all of that publicly. For Blazor, again, a huge list of updates is coming. Again, these are also in that change tracker, so don't take them for granted to be part of Blazor, what I call Blazor 6, but it's might not be called Blazor 6. Hot reload, ahead of time compilation, making it possible to really already compile into WebAssembly. SVG support, desktop support, so it's actually going to be possible to take your Blazor application and run it on the desktop, and also drag and drop support. And there's a whole long list, but I haven't really copied it. Again, also look it up, what Microsoft is going to come out with. And then the biggest change, I think, in the beginning, I mentioned this cross-platform native UI, and that is going to be part of what is known as MAUI. So MAUI is really, it's an abbreviation for multi-platform app UI, is going to bring support for native UI to many platforms, multi-platforms, basically making it possible to run your iOS application, to run your application natively on iOS, natively on Android, natively on the desktop, Windows desktop, but also on your Mac, whatever you want. It's multi-platform native UI that we're going to be getting through a single project. You may be thinking, well, that's what Xamarin Forms is already doing today. Well, this is the evolution of Xamarin Forms. This is the next version. Xamarin as a word, as a name, is not going to be around, let's say, 1.NET 6 comes around. No, it's going to be replaced by MAUI. Does that mean that Xamarin Forms is going to go away? Well, no, it's actually being, let's say, superseded by MAUI. It is part of .NET 6. At this point, you can look at the repos on GitHub, but there's no tooling available yet. The only thing, if you want to see it, you can look at a few videos from Microsoft where they already show some of the early tooling, but there's no official bits available yet. So this is a multi-platform. Like I said, this targets pretty much every platform with a single project, a single code base, which is very cool. You have what you have in Xamarin Forms, but for more platforms, right? Environments, you can do this in Visual Studio, of course, also in Visual Studio Code, not available today with Xamarin Forms. So again, a big plus compared to Xamarin Forms. Like I said, there's no screenshots available publicly yet from Microsoft. Sorry, no tooling. So I took this screenshot from one of the videos. This is what the Xamarin, what a MAUI application will look like. It looks similar to a Blazor. Did I say it again? Yeah, it looks similar to a Xamarin application, Xamarin Forms application. But where a Xamarin Forms application is typically a standard with an Android and iOS project, now it's single project, and your specifics are handled in this single project. So it's a single project structure. And like I said, Xamarin is really going to evolve into MAUI. So Xamarin iOS is going to be replaced by .NET for iOS. Xamarin Android is going to be replaced by .NET for Android. There's a lot of other stuff that is coming, but a lot of stuff are staying. It's important to understand it is still going to be XAML based. So MVVM, all of that is still going to work as far as I can understand and read and that sort of thing at this point. Everything that we've written today in Xamarin Forms should be transferable to MAUI. There should be a conversion flow. Again, the tooling isn't available yet, so I don't know yet how this is going to turn out, but it should be possible to do that. The system that Microsoft uses currently in Xamarin Forms with renderers that basically take your XAML code and render it into something native. That's going to be changing. So there is going to be a different system for that, which is called slim renderers. That's the new way of doing UI. Other interesting features, it's going to be multi-window. It's also not supported in Xamarin Forms. Like I said, VS Code, but also CLI support. It will target the newest Android versions. They're not going to be targeting Android 4 with this. This is the newer versions of Android. It will also use the SDK style projects, so the .NET Core style XML-based project structure, which is also different compared to what we have today. And it's going to be part of .NET. It's going to be built into .NET. Yeah, so that's a separate .NET platform anymore, part of .NET and part of .NET 6. And again, like I said, this is actually going to be a big deal. Follow it on GitHub. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out. Hopefully, we'll get a first public preview as well. And so with that, I expect it to last 75 minutes. So we're pretty much there. So I hope I've given you an answer to questions around .NET 5. .NET 5 is part of this unification wave that I've mentioned already quite a few times. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. This is, I think, after .NET Core, the biggest deal that ever happened, because all of this has been an ultimate dream for Microsoft to bring all that development back into one .NET platform, because there's 3 different platforms. It actually makes a lot of stuff harder than it should be. So bringing that back together is, I think, the ultimate place where Microsoft wanted to be. It's all going to run on that same code base with specifics per platform, but it's all going to run on that same thing. And I think Maui and Tai, definitely worth following. Very interesting technologies. Maui is going to be, I think, a very big deal, allowing us to write native applications again for whatever platform that you want. And so with that, we are at the end of this webinar. First, I want to thank you, of course, for joining this webinar. And I think we can now open it up for questions. So I'm going to exit this window here and look at my other window to answer a couple of questions. Okay, there's a huge list of questions, so feel free to add some of them. So I'm going to go through a couple of questions, and I think we'll do the other questions separately in a blog post or a video. Okay, let me take a look, because there's a lot of long questions here. So someone is asking, what about older versions? Are they going of .NET Core, that is, are they going to be safe to update to .NET 5 and .NET 6? Well, that's a very good question. The person, I can't see the name here, also asks, we have currently a .NET 2.2 application. A .NET 2.2 is actually, I shouldn't say dangerous. Dangerous is not the correct word, but .NET 2.2 is already out of support, right? So in my opinion, you're taking a bit of a risk here. I would say upgrade that already. And why not do that immediately to .NET 5? There is going to be a little bit of rework. I've also had a couple of applications that we put into 2.2, and we upgraded to 3.1, because 2.2 was a bit of a sidetrack. There was a couple of things that were, let's say, reverted going to 3.1. So, but yeah, so there's definitely going to be, yeah, there's no need to basically stay into 2.2. I believe. Yeah. Okay, let's see here. Lots of questions. Let's take this one here. Is there a special add-on? Okay, Simon asks here, is there a special add-on for each platform UI? Why should we then use why should we use .NET 5? The UI part is the only one which really needs improvements when trying to do cross-platform stuff. Yeah, okay. So so Simon is asking, at this point, and I believe this will also be the case still with .NET 6. What are we then sharing with .NET 5? And that's a very good question, and it can be a bit confusing. And the answer is not A or B. It depends on what you're going to be sharing. So .NET 5 as a should I say platform? I think I can say platform. That's technically right. Is actually the foundation that is going to be used for code sharing. And in a sense, and it kind of replaces what we already did in .NET Standard. So all of BCL stuff can be put in there. So all your libraries can be fully based on the plain shared .NET 5 stack. If you bring in, if you want to run, let's say, a .NET 5 application, sorry, a WPF application on top of .NET 5, you will need a specific library, indeed, that brings in WPF and WinForms, whatever. So the .NET 5 Windows package, that's basically going to be required. At this point, you are, let's say, tying your application again directly to Windows, and that's 100% correct. So in that case, you're limiting your code sharing to just what is on top of .NET 5 and not on top of .NET 5 Windows, because that cannot be shared. That's 100% correct. Now, the story, that's because you're then focusing on a Windows-specific technology. You're not focusing on a cross-platform native UI. So the story is therefore, that's where I was going. The story is going to be different when looking at Maui. With Maui, you're actually going to, in a pretty much the same way, I guess, that we're doing it now today with Xamarin Forms, be capable of sharing code across multiple platforms, also UI code. So there's definitely the difference with what you do specifically in non-UI code, and then you bring in UI specific for a platform like .NET 5 Windows, or what you're going to be sharing with things like Maui. Yeah, so Tim asks here, can I do stuff like abstract and that sort of thing on records? Yeah, so basically that's definitely possible. So you can do sealing and that sort of thing. All of that can be done here as well. There's a lot of stuff on records, questions on records. For records, I do refer to Roland's course. For example, someone asked here, can I use it in combination with an EF core data model? I am not 100% sure, but I believe so, but I wouldn't really guarantee, but I haven't tried that yet. Someone asked here, can we do a .NET Framework 4.7 Windows app using a WPF to .NET 5? Well, that's a very good question. And actually, I've not done it with .NET 5, but I actually did it with .NET Core 3.1. There is actually the ability to, let's say, because your WPF app is currently running on the Windows framework. So it's basically taking out the foundation and putting a new foundation underneath. That's what you're doing. And that's actually possible because the .NET, like I said, I did it with .NET Core 3.1, and I therefore assume that it's going to be pretty much the same, maybe even better with .NET 5. It just worked. There was not a lot of changes. I think pretty much none that I had to do. The project type, of course, was different because .NET Core compared to .NET itself, but the code was I think pretty much portable from the one to the other. So why would you do that? You're on a .NET Core stack. If you then use it with .NET 5, you can even share code between that .NET Core, because it's .NET 5, I shouldn't say .NET Core, .NET 5 app with maybe a mobile application. So that code can even be shared. So that's cool. So and performance enhancements again as well. There's a lot of increased performance that you would get there as well. So how straightforward it is it? Well, it's actually very straightforward to update existing WPF apps into .NET 5 and .NET Core in the past. So someone asked here, we currently have a .NET Core 3.1. Would you be upgrading now to .NET 5 or wait for .NET 6? Like I said, that was a no-brainer for me. I would definitely upgrade immediately because of the fact that it was it was super simple. I just had to change the project the .NET 5 target framework in the project file, and I think two more things. I think I had to throw out a reference, a DLL, and one other thing. It's actually, if you search, it's listed on the MSDN website. So it's super simple, and it gives you Oh yeah, it gave me super big performance enhancements. When I showed it to the customer, we said, yeah, we did an upgrade to .NET 5 this morning. It literally took me like half an hour, I think, to do it, maybe even less. And it was like, wow, what did you do? I said, just upgraded to .NET 5. So it was super fast all of a sudden, a lot faster. Mainly, we were doing a lot of JSON serialization, deserialization, and that was one of the things where they had the biggest performance improvements. So everything that worked will 100% work, still work. So the code, there's nothing been removed. They've just added stuff. So I would recommend definitely doing the upgrade already. Someone asks, do you need to update Visual Studio? Yeah, you need to have 2019, and that would be, I think, 16.8. That's the point release is not really important, but the one that I'm using here is 16.83, and so 16.8 is the minimum to actually already support. Someone asked here, there wasn't a lot of mention regarding upgrading a .NET 4 framework application to .NET 5. Is that also a seamless upgrade? Well, I may have, and it's actually a couple of times this has been asked. So to be clear, there is no upgrade path automatically that I know of that is going to do that. So even the WPF thing I just explained, this is still manual work that needs to be done. You need to take .NET framework out and bring the new project in. But it should it's a manual process. You're going to have to do basically copy pasting on the code. And bring in the correct references and make sure that your packages also work for .NET 5 and .NET Core. But it's a manual process. There is no right-click update to .NET 5 available. So that I think Microsoft is not going to do that because it would be pretty hard to do that, I guess. So you can upgrade to .NET Core 3.1. So pretty much any .NET Core 3.1 can just be targeted here to .NET 3.5, but this doesn't work for .NET itself. So plain .NET framework, no, there's not going to be an automatic upgrade path. So that's something you're going to have to be doing yourself. And all these changes, and that's going to be the last question that I'm doing because we have still a long list and I don't want to go over the 1.5 hour here. Yeah, all these things that are shown here in Blazor, someone asks, do they also apply to client-side Blazor? Yes, they are shared across the board. Some actually that I showed are client-side Blazor only, like the ability to basically download on demand. So the splitting up your application that actually only applies to client-side Blazor. That doesn't exist for server-side Blazor. And so with that, I think we are good. So I want to show you again my contact details here. And maybe also do a little plug for my latest course that I released a little over a week ago. It's doing quite well, which is an advanced .NET Core, ASP.NET Core architecture course. Takes you through architecting a full ASP.NET Core API using practices of clean architecture. So it's a bit more an advanced course, but I invite you to take a look at it and give me some feedback on how you like it. And so with that, I'm pretty much at the end of the presentation. So Daniel, anything else from you?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you so much. This has been so much good content, and
Thank
also for tackling all those questions. Like you mentioned, there are some you weren't able to get to. We'll connect after this about if it's a blog post or a video, some way to get to some more of these questions, because we really appreciate everyone that asked those. I just wanted to give you the opportunity before we take off here to maybe leave one final takeaway with everyone that's still here.
Don't wait. It's what I think is, and it's maybe a bit of a messaging that some people, for some reason, I haven't seen this with previous versions of .NET that Microsoft that people were saying, oh, should we already update or should we not? I think people are still a bit confused around that current release thing and that supporting, and that's also why I put a lot of emphasis on that, so that people actually say, well, let's take advantage of these new things straight away. So that's maybe my last takeaway here.
That's great. Well, thanks again to everyone that joined us. Thanks again, Gill, for taking this time. And everyone have a great rest of their day.